Okay, hello everyone. It's great to see everybody logging on from so many different parts of the world. Welcome everyone to this most recent addition to our educational webinar series, A Brewer's Guide to Hydrogen Sulfide. H2S is produced by yeast during a normal beer fermentation and is usually considered an off flavor. The biochemistry of sulfur metabolism is complex, and H2S levels are influenced by several factors, many of which can be controlled by the brewer. Lallemand Brewing recently released a technical paper about H2S in beer, which is linked below on this webinar, as well as on our website. The talk today is to focus more on the practical aspects of how to manage H2S in the brewery. We're joined today by Gianmaria Ricciardi, Lallemand Brewing Technical Sales Manager for Italy and Slovenia, and Tim Foley, the Research Scientist for the Siebel Institute of Technology. Gianmaria will give a brief overview of H2S metabolism and biochemistry before giving the floor to Tim, who will discuss how to control H2S levels in the brewery, including prevention, detection, and corrective actions. The Siebel Institute, North America's oldest brewing school, has been training brewers from around the world for the last 150 years and has been part of the Lallemand Group since 2000. In collaboration with the Siebel Institute, Lallemand is proud to contribute to the ongoing education of our great brewing community. This webinar should take about 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute question and answer period at the end. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat at the bottom and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. So with that, I'll turn the mic over to Gianmaria to lead us through an introduction to H2S metabolism. You can go ahead, Gianmaria.
Hello, thank you, Eric. Just go to share the screen. Okay, I guess you can see my screen now. So hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar. I will be with you for the next few minutes today just to give you a brief and quick introduction to an interesting topic that we as Lallemand have been working on recently. As Eric just said, and as you might have already noticed, we released a new technical paper on the topic of hydrogen sulfide, which will be the subject of the day. So let's get started then. This apparently is a small molecule, but however, it plays a big and crucial role in the brewing process. In fact, the metabolism of these simple compounds is of special relevance considering the beer quality in general. It has been known in the brewing industry since the end of the 19th century, and in terms of physical and chemical properties, it is characterized to be a very volatile compounds with a very low flavor threshold. So as you can see, we are talking about micrograms per liter. So very, very tiny amount of it. It has a distinctive flavor profile, usually described as no flavor, reminding rotten eggs. Our next speaker, Tim, will show us more information about it after this introduction. However, the effort to detect it could be due to the fact that it's not always easy to identify. In fact, it can easily react with other molecules or either be converted to other different compounds due to different environmental conditions, such as pH changes, changes in temperature, and other technological aspects. Anyway, keep in mind that small amounts of sulfur compounds can be acceptable or even desirable in some specific beer style. If you think, for instance, at the traditional pale ale from Barton-on-Trent or some specific lager styles. As you might know, sulfur is an element very abundant in nature, being one of the most important elements required for the biological life. And it's present in many different compounds, particularly as a component of the amino acid cysteine and methionine, as we will discuss in a bit, as well as other component of other vital cofactors such as vitamins and others. So many different microorganisms, including the brewing yeast schematically represented on this slide, can metabolize sulfur compounds by different pathways. This means that the production of H2S, as well as other sulfur compounds, can come from contamination issues as well. So this is another important reason why we should keep the cleaning procedures always at the highest. As we were saying, the brewing yeast can undertake the production of H2S by different pathways, but we also know that the brewing yeast in the brewing conditions prefers fermentation over respirations. So the common pathway that will be the sulfate assimilatory reduction pathway, also known as SRS, which is represented on this slide, that represent the preferred pathway for the Saccharomyces cerevisiae. As we can see, the sulfate is taken up and used for the biosynthesis of some organic sulfur compounds, such as the already mentioned methionine and cysteine. And as we said, the hydrogen sulfide, it is produced by the normal metabolism of the yeast through several reaction steps, which involves different enzymes and genes, as we can see. And knowing actually how these enzymes and genes work is interesting to understand other potential applications regarding new genetic techniques and breeding techniques, for instance, that will help to modulate certain pathways. As we can appreciate from this slide, there are some genes that are directly responsible for the conversion of sulfide into sulfide and its subsequent release into the media as H2S. So ideally, being able to manipulate and reduce the activity of these specific genes, we are potentially able to reduce the liberation of H2S into the fermenting beer. And this is exactly what happened for one of our recent strains that we released, the Lallemand farmhouse, which is a new hybrid saison yeast selected for not being a diastaticus, but that thanks to these cutting edges and a specific patented technique has been also selected to have a modification on the nucleotide sequence of this specific gene, the methane gene, which does not allow basically the conversion to sulfide into free hydrogen sulfide. Anyway, I don't want to go too much in detail on this topic. You can easily and find plenty of materials on this on our website, downloading our technical paper, as we said, following us on social media, or even directly contacting us. So from this slide, we've just seen that the sulfate entered the cell by a transporter, by a specific transporter, and it is reduced in a sequence of energy-requiring reactions and finally incorporated into the sulfur-containing amino acid, as we were mentioning. So basically, in those words, with a high level of adjunctions, that could be a deficiency of these two essential amino acids. So the yeast needs to increase this pathway, the SRS pathway, just to compensate the lack of those and creating more sulfur ions for the synthesis of them. As we were mentioning before, it is generally admitted that the major pathway for the H2S formation is the SRS that we just saw, and it's pretty much strain dependent. In fact, as you can see from the graph on this slide, there are at least 6 different categories of sulfur behavior conditions, where basically some strains will produce or not produce H2S independently from the environmental condition. Other that are stressed when nitrogen compounds are limited, or other essential microelements are limited, or even both of them, and others that are actually more affected by other stressing condition and technological aspects, such as the osmotic pressure by the evolving CO2 produced during the fermentation, or rapid changes in temperature, as well as many other technological conditions. In the brewing environment, although the levels of free methionine and cysteines are higher than in other fermenting beverages industry like wine, some shortages could be possible, leading to the production of various sulfur compounds. For instance, in the brewing process, part of the methionine can be lost during the meshing process by purely chemical means. Other environmental factors that can affect the H2S production include also the high level of elemental sulfur, and the presence of sulfur dioxide, the presence of sulfur-containing organic compounds, but also the deficiency of other very important elements such as vitamins like the panthenate and others. So on the graph on the right-hand side of this slide, it is shown the relationship with H2S peaks production related to the yeast cycle, the growth and the budding cycles, suggesting that during these cycles, the yeast continually produce and reabsorbs the H2S based on as well on the different fermentation conditions, such as the already mentioned temperature, CO2 pressure, trap content, or even water aeration. So in addition to the metabolic characteristics of each microorganism and strain, also the nutritional condition can affect and modulate the production of H2S. In fact, when enough nitrogen is present in the medium, precursors of the essential amino acid methionine and cysteine will be able to sequester the HS ion, avoiding their release into the media. But when nitrogen is limited instead, insufficient precursors will be available, and H2S will be free to accumulate it in the cell firstly, and then diffuse into the fermenting wort later. So during the synthesis of sulfur-containing amino acids, and particularly during the multiplication phase, the yeast can use both the organic and inorganic sulfur compounds. However, as Tim will explain to us, also the quality of the nutrition will play a key role on the production of H2S. We can then summing up by saying that the production of H2S is a natural way for the yeast to cope with the accumulation of a large amount of hydrogen ions in the cell produced during the fermentation activity for the synthesis of those essential amino acids by the SRS pathway that we just briefly discussed on the previous slides, which create, of course, a very stressing and acidic medium and environment into the yeast cell. So if the yeast did not eliminate this excess of hydrogen ions, it won't survive the stress. So concluding this brief introduction, I hope I provide you with an overview on this topic with some good takeaways regarding the composition of the hydrogen sulfide and how it is produced during the brewing process by the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, as well as the importance of considering the three fundamental conditions to limit its production as much as possible during the fermentation and maturation, and avoiding any potential quality issues downstream the process. So I will leave the stage to Tim that will guide us to other interesting aspects on these subjects, and thanks for listening.
Okay, great. We'll try and share the screen here and get on to our next section of what we'll talk about. Sorry, it's taking me just a second here. Be patient with me as we move through here. I'm having some difficulties here.
I'm here for you, Tim. Do you need help?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not popping up. You guys don't see it, obviously.
No, not yet.
Okay, we'll try it again. Let's go back from the start and see if we can do it. There it is. And hopefully it'll pop up right now. Do we have it?
Yes, looks good. All we need is presentation mode, and then you can start rolling.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So, Jean-Maria has taken us through the scientific side of hydrogen sulfide production. on the cellular or metabolic level and things that influence us in that formation. So now we'd like to take a look at H2S from more of a brewer's perspective. So we'll try to run through a review of the points that Jean-Marie has mentioned, and then we'll emphasize how we like to elaborate on some of these practical approaches as we move through the brewing process. So just as a quick review, as Jean-Marie has said, hydrogen sulfide production occurs naturally during beer fermentations. And the graph to the right, which we've seen previously, dictates how that happens and what generally occurs over the process of the fermentation. As mentioned previously, we know that some yeast strains naturally produce higher concentrations of the hydrogen sulfide relative to other strains. And we saw that with the 6 different strains that Jean-Marie has demonstrated under different environmental conditions or fermentation conditions. And on the next slide, you'll see that hydrogen or sulfur products in general are produced by all yeast strains and the various sulfur compounds. And them can include sulfur dioxide, various mercaptans, ethyl and methyl mercaptans, as well as hydrogen sulfide. So if we move on, we'll see that the rise and fall of hydrogen sulfide is dynamic. And hydrogen is a very reactive compound. So as hydrogen builds up within the cell, under normal metabolic activity, it becomes very reactive. And hydrogen sulfide is just one of the many products of these reactions, as well as the reactions under the SRS pathway that Jean-Marie has elaborated on. So really, excess hydrogen sulfide is produced for a number of different reasons, and we've already seen they're related to nutrition and environment. But really, to simplify things even more, we'll see how various stress factors are really what influences the concentrations of H2S production on a cellular level. And just to touch on these points once again, we see that it comes down to low levels of nutrition, especially when it relates to nitrogen, excessive fermentation temperatures, either high or low temperatures, puts excess stress on the yeast. Low pH levels in our initial wort going into fermentation can influence hydrogen sulfide levels, as well as dissolved oxygen levels in our wort stream. We'll see as we move through premature flocculation of our yeast and how other factors can influence that, can affect H2S production, and then yeast autolysis as well. So what it really comes down to in a nutshell is having a viable and vital yeast cells in a very supportive substrate, like we say, at the right pH levels, with the right nutrition levels. And it's going to create a happy and healthy environment for our yeast cells and keep the H2S production as low as possible for that particular strain. And when we talk about viability, really, we tend to define viability as the number or the percentage of live yeast cells. And typically, when we're pitching our yeast, we want that live yeast cell percentage to be above 95. That's just a very general number. When we talk about vitality of our yeast cells, that's a little bit different. Vitality refers to a cell's general health or vigor. In a nutshell, it's the cell's, the yeast's ability to ferment, its rate of reproduction, its physiological size and fitness. But we also have to consider where the yeast cell is in its life cycle, what generation it's on. Obviously, our yeast crop has a varying range of generations, but as we continue to repitch from batch to batch, that life cycle average increases. So really, vitality refers to the metabolic activity of the cell. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll kind of try and cover, as we move through the process, the most factors that influence H2S production. So obviously, the quality of the raw materials has a definite impact. We talked about nutrition, and having high quality raw materials is a definite when we're looking at producing high quality beer. Obviously, water adjustment is important as well. So when we talk about water adjustment, we talk about various minerals that aid in the enzymatic reactions that are going to take place in the mash tun. So many of these minerals act as cofactors or catalysts in various reactions. Some of these salts or minerals can also aid in buffering the mash in order to keep a consistent environment throughout the mashing process. So it also, we may add acids or acidified malts in order to create that optimal pH range in the mash tun as well. Again, we talk about proper mashing techniques. And specifically here, we mentioned protease activity in order to create the proper range of peptides, amino acids, and free amino nitrogens for proper yeast nutrition. But it also comes down to creating the proper spectrum of both fermentable and non-fermentable carbohydrates based on the particular beer style we're trying to create. We have to remember, if nitrogen is limiting, then hydrogen sulfide has the potential to build up in the cell and eventually move into or diffuse into our wort or beer. We also, from the saccharification reactions, have to create that optimal sugar profile for yeast growth. So if we move back to the high quality raw materials, we have to also realize that some of the beer styles we're producing use alternative materials or adjuncts that have lower protein levels than our typical all malt worts. Because in all malt worts, we generally contain everything that a yeast cell needs for a healthy fermentation or a healthy fermentation environment. So when we use alternative materials, lower protein adjuncts, for example, then we like to look at possibly the use of some yeast nutrients or supplemental materials in order to bump up the nutrient levels and create a consistent environment in our wort, in the substrate. And typically, these minerals act as cofactors and catalysts in some of the enzymatic reactions that take place during fermentation, both intracellularly and extracellularly in the medium. When we talk about nutrients, just in a nutshell, there's several areas to consider. Obviously, different sources of yeast nutrients, some of these supplements contain different sources of nitrogen, and there's organic sources versus inorganic sources. So organic sources typically come from autolyzed yeast and things of that nature, whereas inorganic sources strictly refer to diammonium phosphate or urea. as your sources of nitrogen. And obviously, for these supplements or these yeast nutrients, we'd like to have a balanced environment with both vitamins, minerals, and nitrogen sources. And that typically lends itself to the highest form of yeast health and the lowest sulfur production. And really, when we talk about these yeast nutrients, the best sources in general, based on various literature published, has been the organic sources and low nitrogen environments when using high adjuncts or high levels of alternative sugar sources. The organic sources or the balanced yeast nutrients typically perform best. If we talk about the next point, proper coagulation of the true solids or removal of these solids upstream in the brew house before we get to the fermenter, really we're referring to proper wort clarification. And really, when we talk about proper clarification of the wort prior to entering the fermentation vessel, it lends itself to optimal yeast reproduction. Because some of these solids that are carried over can either bind to the cell membranes and interfere with reproduction and metabolism because they interfere with diffusion of materials across the cell membrane. Binding of some of these solids that are carried over can also interfere with the yeast cell by leading to premature settling or precipitation of these yeast cells and removing them from suspension so they're not able to carry out their responsibilities during the fermentation process. And it has that impact on yeast settling rates. So we want to have a clear wort with the proper nutrition, proper pH levels, and proper buffering at this point in the process. And then the last point lends itself to proper wort aeration. Obviously, dissolved oxygen is a growth factor, and it allows for optimal yeast reproduction. Once those yeast cells rapidly accept and take up that oxygen that's in solution, it can begin that growth phase. And oxygen itself contributes to membrane formation in new cells and especially membrane fluidity in creating those sterols that allow the diffusion across the cell membrane. And typically the general rule of thumb is for every degree Plato of your wort, you want to have 1 part per million of dissolved oxygen in solution, obviously. And typically, if we're brewing 2 gravity at a level of 11 to 12 degrees Plato, then we desire a minimum level of 8 to 10 parts per million of dissolved oxygen. We should also mention at this point, over aeration of our wort can be just as bad as under aeration. If we add too much dissolved oxygen into our wort, too much oxygen in solution, it extends our lag phase and our growth phase. And the dissolved oxygen is taken up by the yeast cells and lends itself to cell reproduction rather than moving into the metabolic phase and the production of ethanol and CO2 to simplify it. So we end up with excess cells or excess yeast biomass rather than moving into our fermentation phase. So if we move into the next stage, out of the brew house and into fermentation, obviously there's several points we might want to make, and we'll begin with the yeast strain. Jean-Marie already mentioned that particular yeast strains lend themselves to higher levels of H2S production. If we're choosing a yeast strain to produce a new beer style or a new brand, then we can choose a strain that incorporates those characteristics. Unfortunately, most of the time, we walk into beer that's being produced, and we have to try to manipulate the concentrations of hydrogen sulfide production and optimize or minimize the levels that are produced in the beer or in the process that we've inherited. So really, when it comes to yeast strains, it's not only their typical level of H2S production, but it's also how that strain responds to the physiological and environmental factors that it encounters in each batch that we produce, and how consistent we keep those environmental factors. We should also mention, like Jean-Marie did, that Lallemand is developing strains that have reduced levels of hydrogen sulfide production. So when we talk about controlling H2S production in fermentation, we want to introduce the proper substrate, our wort. And we talked about how we control that from the brew house into the fermenter. So we need the nutrient levels in the wort to be correct. Nitrogen, minerals, vitamins that are going to lend themselves to a healthy yeast strain. Reduce the stress on the yeast strain. High stress typically relates to higher levels of hydrogen sulfide production. We want the pH levels to be optimal so that we don't put undue stress on the yeast strains. And once again, we want those dissolved oxygen levels to be optimal for cell reproduction and taken up so to produce the number of cells that are adequate but not overproduce biomass of yeast. So the pH levels really help to create that environment that's conducive to cell performance, that reproduction and metabolism. And once again, oxygen is a growth factor in the reproduction phase. We move on to fermentation temperatures. Obviously, high temperatures put higher stress on the yeast cells and generally lead to that higher concentration of H2S over time. Low temperatures generally can lead to premature levels of yeast precipitation or yeast flocculation, early flocculation. And that typically can extend fermentation times, and then later on in the process leads to lower levels of resorption of the H2S by the yeast cell itself. And if we move on to the next point with that optimal flocculation characteristics of the yeast, once again, that directly relates to uptake of H2S post-fermentation by the yeast cells. So premature flocculation can lead to lower yeast counts in suspension. So after full attenuation of the wort, we see that there's fewer yeast cells in suspension to resorb those flavor compounds, flavor and aroma compounds. So when we talk about yeast health, in general, other than freshly propagated pitches, if we're repitching our yeast strains, we want to reduce that foreign solids carryover. Like we talked about earlier with proper wort clarification coming from the brew house, if we're cropping or harvesting our yeast from previous fermentations, we want to reduce the amount of solids carryover. So it's not only the initial viability and vitality of that strain with the freshly propagated wort, but the health of the yeast throughout the fermentation and how we pass on that health, that vitality and that viability to subsequent generations by repitching. So carryover from the brew house, we already talked about contaminating or interfering with the cell membranes, and has the potential to increase those off flavors, not only H2S, but other off flavors, but can lead to premature yeast sedimentation. So if we just quickly look at how we schedule our yeast cropping or our yeast harvesting, as we collect yeast from the fermentation, post-fermentation from the yeast cone, from the fermentation cone. So typically, anything that collects early in the cone of the fermenter at the end of fermentation is discarded. Generally, this contains partial yeast cells or yeast fragments, dead cells, a high percentage of trube solids or cold break, materials that have been carried over from the brew house and settled out early, and hop resins. So this is material we do not want to carry over to subsequent fermentation. So typically, this early collection is discarded. Mid collections of our yeast are typically our core layers, and these are the collections that we're going to retain for subsequent repitchings. These typically contain healthy yeast cells in a high percentage. Generally, it's a creamy yeast slurry. And then once again, in later collections, we're going to see smaller yeast cells, less flocculent yeast cells, particles that are contained from foam collapse or the Brauhefen that's contained on the vessel walls, and even some colloidal materials that have coalesced and precipitated out as they become larger during the cooling process. So these late collections are also typically discarded. So regardless of your yeast collection schedule, generally it's done in various phases, anywhere from 3 to 4 to 6 collection phases. And those mid collections are the core layers that we retain for pitching subsequent generations. One of the things we don't mention is how yeast that's collecting in the cone over time is exposed to high hydrostatic pressures from the liquid levels above the yeast cone. So proper collection methods are critical when repitching our yeast for yeast health. These various factors that are carried out during fermentation have a great influence on H2S production, or have the potential to have a great influence. So if we move on to the maturation stage, obviously the vast majority of our H2S production occurs during fermentation. And most of that H2S is removed or eliminated, what we'll refer to as scrubbed out during the fermentation phase, naturally by CO2 evolution throughout the process. One of the things that can influence that removal of H2S, because it's a very volatile compound, moving out into the headspace during the later phases of fermentation, is a lack of sufficient headspace or volume above the liquid level within that fermentation vessel. And that can impede this volatilization of the hydrogen sulfide. But if we move on to the steps that are carried out during maturation, how they influence H2S resorption or uptake by the yeast cell, first we can start with cooling. So obviously, whether we're crash cooling in a unit tank or we're cooling to some degree in our fermentation vessel and then transferring to a dedicated maturation tank, we don't want to rapidly decrease those temperatures. Rapid temperature drops can shock the yeast and potentially accelerate yeast sedimentation. So we can prematurely precipitate those yeast cells and remove them too rapidly from suspension, and then those cells are not able to resorb or uptake any H2S that may remain in suspension. Much like the yeast cells resorb diacetyl at this stage of the process, the H2S is taken up by the cell post-fermentation in this maturation stage and removed from solution. But in order for that to happen, like we've already mentioned, yeast cells have to remain in suspension, at least to some degree. And we have to allow enough time for this resorption to take place. So the maturation stage, depending on the beer style, has to last at least some period of time. And that will be dependent on the beer style, the amount of hydrogen sulfide that's typically produced in the fermentation stage and is carried over to this stage in the process, not naturally removed by CO2 evolution or scrubbed out. And then, of course, those yeast cells that remain in suspension have to be healthy yeast cells, very viable and vital yeast cells. So longer maturation is generally required for lager beers because they're fermented at lower temperatures. We don't get the same vigor of CO2 evolution as rapid CO2 evolution because we're fermenting at lower temperatures. So our maturation times are generally slower and longer and lower temperature maturation periods. So one of the other reasons we want to typically mature our lager fermentations are that not only are there slower rates of H2S uptake at lower maturation temperatures, but hydrogen sulfide is typically in international lagers easier to perceive. And that's because most international lagers are relatively lightly flavored, mild flavored beers with a light flavor profile. There's no potential masking of this flavor compound and aroma compound from specialty malts. You don't have those caramel or roasted flavors in the international lager styles. And generally, they're typically lower bitterness and lower hop aroma compounds to potentially mask the H2S flavor. If we talk about after maturation, and if we still have the presence of hydrogen sulfide in the finished product post-maturation or late in our maturation phase, let's talk about some potential corrective measures. And really, like we say here, they're potential corrective measures because it's difficult once the yeast is removed from suspension to reduce the amount of H2S in solution. Really it comes down to yeast health. So in subsequent fermentations, we'd have to optimize our yeast health. Have we gone too far in the number of generations that we've repitched? Typically, we're looking at repitching 8 to 10 generations. We like to keep it below 8 if we can. If not, we'd like it to keep it below 10 generations. Obviously, in some brewery environments, that's not possible. We're pitching many higher generations than that because we don't have the opportunity to propagate fresh yeast crops. But if we have the opportunity, we want to limit the number of generations in order to improve our overall yeast health. Obviously, we want to reduce the stress level by optimizing nutrition levels in our wort, our pH levels, our high vitality, optimizing that potential for H2S uptake by the yeast cells that are in suspension. But that's something we have to think about upfront and in subsequent generations. Jean-Maria also mentioned proper cleaning and sanitation because some microorganisms that have the potential to thrive in wort or beer can produce levels of H2S that we're able to pick up. So some of these might be Zymomonas, Megasphaera, Pectinatus, and some other organisms. So they have the potential to produce hydrogen sulfide as well as other compounds that are off flavors in the finished product. So cleaning and sanitation, obviously a critical issue. But much like the yeast health, these are two things that we have to look at for future fermentations and maturations. If we're going to try and address correcting or eliminating hydrogen sulfide downstream, how can we do it? Well, once again, we can look to extend that aging time, that maturation step in the presence of yeast, keeping that yeast in suspension to see if we can reduce those levels of H2S. Obviously, time is of the essence. Hold time in vessels is limited. So we don't have the luxury of having excess tank space. We've got beer to produce. So this is a potential to look at, but not always a viable option. One of the other things we can look to do is purging the maturation vessel or the bright tank with CO2. Once again, this is a potential, but this is a very delicate process. We have to carry this CO2 purging out under the correct conditions. We have to have the correct back pressure in the headspace of the vessel. We have to bubble CO2 through the liquid, through our finished beer, very gently, and try and control the environment within that bright beer tank or maturation tank. We can also create damage to the finished beer because not only are we removing H2S as a potential volatile compound, but we're removing other positive volatiles and aromatic compounds from our finished product. So we're altering our finished product in general, not only to remove the hydrogen sulfide, but we'll also have the potential to remove other materials, hop aromatics and such. If the process is not controlled properly, we can also create excess foaming within the vessel, and that can lead to diminishing our foam properties downstream in the finished product, in the finished package. So it's a very delicate process, and it's not always possible. Another alternative is copper treatment. There's various means of copper treatment, various methods. The most common of which is the addition of copper sulfate to the beer. This is an insoluble material that's non-volatile. And really what happens is that it reacts with the hydrogen sulfide to create copper sulfide, which then precipitates out of the beer. Once again, this takes time to occur. It's also something that we have to think about because adding copper sulfate to our beer isn't something that we like to do for a number of reasons. Obviously, copper concentrations in our finished product are regulated. They have to be below certain levels. And then we also have to be aware of the fact that copper is also a catalyst in many oxidation reactions. So if there is copper remaining in solution in our finished product, we have the capability to accelerate some of these oxidation reactions that occur downstream. So that's some ways that we've looked at potentially controlling H2S production throughout the process, various stages of the process. Jean-Marie mentioned that detecting H2S is difficult, and you have to have the proper equipment to do so. And really, one of the best ways to determine the presence or absence of hydrogen sulfide is using your senses. So the aromatics and the flavor of hydrogen sulfide are very specific. Like we mentioned, most should be removed naturally during the normal brewing process, during the fermentation stage. The best way to determine the presence or absence, once again, is familiarizing yourself with hydrogen sulfide. And that's to train yourself and your brewing staff or brewery personnel how to detect hydrogen sulfide in the brewery throughout the process. And really, it's our sensitivity to the presence of hydrogen sulfide and really sulfur compounds in general in the beer is very acute because many sulfur compounds are associated with things that are negatively affect us in nature. And some of these sulfur compounds are relegated as potentially toxic. So our senses are very acute for sulfur compounds, and H2S is one of those. Like we've already mentioned, it tends to be a rotten egg type aroma. It's very distinct. We can monitor this really by anytime we sample from our fermenter at various points during the fermentation process, or from our maturation vessel or unit tank as we're in the maturation stage, or even into our bright tank going into our finished packaged beer. When we sample in order to test for pH, gravity levels, cell counts, anything of that nature, regardless of how sophisticated your lab is, we should always use our senses in order to evaluate those samples. And one of those is to bring a group of panelists together and determine whether or not any off flavors are present, but especially those for the presence or absence of hydrogen sulfide. So evaluating a samples side by side during training is critical in order to train your staff or your brewery personnel for the presence or absence of hydrogen sulfide. And really, there's very standardized training structures for panelists, qualifying panelists or staff members for identifying these compounds. Obviously, Siebel operates various courses, training courses for these needs. We have specialty courses such as the Master of Beer Styles or sensory panel management for those that are going to train other staff members on how to not only identify various compounds, but carry out taste panels for qualifying various batches produced throughout the brewery. And then we also carry out a beer sommelier course, which is very similar to Cicerone courses many people are familiar with. In our intermediate courses, such as the Concise course in Brewing Technology, we carry out a limited amount of training in sensory panels. And then in all of our advanced courses, the Advanced Brewing Theory courses, the Diploma in Brewing Technology course, and the Master Brewers course, we carry out extensive training in sensory training itself, but also managing taste panels. And then as well, Siebel sells sensory training kits that can be used in the brewery to identify various compounds and test your panelists on a regular basis to identify various compounds. So trained taste panelists are really the best way to evaluate samples on a continuous basis, both through the process and with the finished product. But we should be aware, if we're going to carry out such panels and use our sensory panels to identify these compounds, that there are some potential issues with panelists and using sensory profiles or panels as a quality assurance tool. And really, there's some of these are cultural or regional bias. If we consume certain foods or are adapted to certain environments that include some of these flavors or aromas, we adapt to those and our senses aren't quite as acute to some of these various flavors. Panelists can also be under fatigue, whether it's physical fatigue, mental fatigue, or fatigue with too many samples during a specific taste panel. So we typically limit the number of samples to between 4 and 6, and typically no more than 8 samples. There's also acuity differences naturally between panelists. One panelist may be very in tune with a specific flavor compound, such as hydrogen sulfide, while another panelist may be blind to that particular flavor or aroma. And that, like we already mentioned, there can be adaptation over time. So constant or continuous exposure to a flavor or aroma can lower the detection ability of individual panelists over time. The health of an individual panelist can also influence how they pick up various flavors and aromas in samples. And finally, the age of a panelist can influence that as well. Typically with age, we see reduced identification during tasting of samples, but we notice that aroma identification doesn't really tend to change. So really, that's the takeaway on a practical basis. Everything from brew house, fermentation, maturation, how we can try and control the levels of H2S throughout the process, and then how we can detect those levels and the best way to do so. And training our staff and identifying potential panelists in the process is really the best way to carry that out. So hopefully we've done what we wanted to do here and identified some areas that H2S is produced, and we can now maybe address some questions.
Thanks very much, Tim. It was a great presentation. Thank you, John Maria, as well. We do have a few questions that have come up in the chat. I'll take the first one. I'll paraphrase a little bit related to nutrition. You mentioned that for beers that have a high level of adjuncts, that nutrients are critical. In general, though, do you recommend adding a nutrient on a regular basis to fermentations that don't necessarily have a high level of adjuncts as a way to avoid potential production of H2S during fermentation?
Well, if I quickly address that, I would say, and like we mentioned, in all malt worts, typically the yeast cells have all they need in order to carry out consistent and healthy fermentations. With that said, obviously raw materials are a natural product. They vary to some degree from batch to batch, different times of the year, and with age. So adding a yeast nutrient is not something that will ever be negative. It almost helps to create a more consistent environment in the wort. But obviously, it's an added cost. So a yeast nutrient can always help. You'll never add too much nitrogen or too many minerals or vitamins that will inhibit yeast cell health. But it's a consistent added cost. And if it's not necessary, it may be frowned upon by those looking at the bottom line.
Just as a follow-up question to that, would adding nutrients on a regular basis to each fermentation help for those who are repitching, especially to higher generation numbers?
I think if you're pitching at more than the recommended number of generations, which many brewers are, especially brewers who are pitching cone to cone, smaller brewery atmospheres, it probably can ultimately help increase the cell's like we talked about vitality over time. But of course, there's a lot of other influencing factors that come into play there. So it's not just that yeast nutrient itself; it's keeping the yeast healthy and the entirety of the environment. So once again, it has the potential to aid in this way as well, but it's not the only factor.
Yeah.
Okay. Move on to the next question. Oh,
can I add
John,
something? Yeah. So just because, as Tim was saying, not be focused just on the raw materials, but also some specific styles, such as the very popular sour beer recently. We got some extreme condition that can affect, as we said, also the production of H2S specifically. So we have to consider the whole condition based on the process, raw materials, technological aspects, as we mentioned during this presentation.
Thank you, John Maria. One other question from Michael Smith. How many days would you recommend in the maturation phase for both ale and lager beers?
That's a loaded question. I think it varies so greatly from brewer to brewer on how much beer you're pushing through the system, your available tank space, your capacity. There are brewers who are pushing with limited maturations on ales as long as they're getting enough clarification and they're able to crop healthy yeast from the cone. If they're performing maturation in a unit tank, in a cylindrical conical vessel, in 3 to 4 days post crash. So I would say typically in ale fermentations, we're looking at anywhere from 5 to 7, and that's on the high end for a number of brewers. And for lager fermentations, obviously, in small brewery atmospheres, it's limited. But from brew house to finished product, generally, you're looking at a window for international lager styles for about 21 days is very typical. So our maturation period could be anywhere from 10 to 14 days. Like we say, there's such a range and such a variability depending on your capacity and how fast you need to push beer through. And really it comes down to, is it meeting your specifications for flavor, for yeast cell counts, for hitting end of fermentation gravities, everything else in between. So if it doesn't meet customer expectations, and really your expectations, which should be even stricter than that, then it's hard to define. But typically, like we said, you're looking in 5 to 7 or 10 to 14.
Okay, thank you. Just a follow-up question on that. Would using a nutrient potentially allow the brewer to reduce the maturation phase?
Typically, I'd say it doesn't have as much of an influence on that as it has on yeast assimilation of the nutrients, minerals, and reproduction and healthy cells for proper fermentation and reaching end gravity. I think it has less of an influence on uptake. As long as the cells are healthy that remain in suspension, you'll get that resorption to be carried out. And like we already mentioned, the vast majority of hydrogen sulfide is typically removed during the fermentation process naturally by that CO2 scrubbing, natural CO2 evolution, as long as that fermentation is vigorous.
Okay, one more question. Is it possible to detect incoming sulfites in water? And if they are high, is it possible to remove them ahead of brewing?
Yes,
I think they meant sulfates, not sulfites.
Yeah, you can determine the quality of your water, obviously, by having a water analysis done. Smaller brewers might have that done on a yearly basis or quarterly basis. Larger brewers are analyzing their water quality consistently. Obviously, we want to do as much as we're capable of in controlling our processed water. So even incoming water from a municipal source, a municipal supply that's already going through some water treatment, we'd like to have some control of our water. And typically, the minimal control is particulate filters and carbon filters in order to remove chloride. But yes, we can determine those levels and help control them during our water treatment. Some brewers go through an RO process, a reverse osmosis process, and they rebuild their water with various salts in order to accommodate the beer styles they're producing. So there's a lot of variability in water supplies, whether it's groundwater supplies or municipal supplies of water. Testing our water to know what is coming in, and then testing our water post in-house treatment to know what we've got as processed water is definitely critical. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. One final question. When cold crashing, what is considered a rapid temperature drop? How slowly should a brewer be crashing their beer?
Yeah, obviously it depends on your fermentation temperature. So typically we're looking to get down anywhere from 0 to 2 degrees C for our maturation temperatures. So if we're performing an ale fermentation, we're all the way up at between 18 and 21, 22 degrees C for an extreme. That's going to take a little longer. But typically, the typical range for crashing is anywhere from 24 to 36 hours. If the temperatures are higher, typically we're looking anywhere from 24 to 48 hour crash cooling time. And like we mentioned, that's just going to influence the rate of your flocculation and precipitation of your yeast cells. So if it's premature and you do have levels of H2S in solution, that could impede that resorption period. So, or prolong it if we don't have enough yeast in suspension. So typically that 24 to 36 hour window is a good rule of thumb. We might add on to that if we're fermenting at higher temperatures.
Okay, thank you. We're a little bit over the hour point. I'm going to keep taking questions if that's okay. If anybody needs to leave the presentation, this will again be posted on our website to see later. Next question regarding fermenting under pressure and what effect that may have on H2S production.
Yeah, I think Jean-Marie touched a little bit on it, that it can definitely affect the levels of H2S production as well as other flavors. Generally, esters and aldehydes are typically affected by osmotic pressure. So fermenting under pressure definitely has an influence, and that varies yeast strain to yeast strain like everything else. And it depends on the level of osmotic pressure that's created. So there's a lot of variability when it comes to that. That's probably a whole nother topic, really, to tell you the truth, that how that impacts flavor formation in general. So it definitely has an influence, and it can definitely have an influence on H2S production as well. Okay. Typically, it increases H2S production as a general rule of thumb with most strains. And I think Jean-Marie's chart mentioned, he verbally mentioned it, but you see in the chart that various environmental changes led to increases in H2S.
Okay, we'll take one final question about yeast harvesting. When you collect yeast, considering the hydrostatic pressure that the yeast is exposed to, what is the optimal harvest time to keep yeast healthy, and how long can you go typically before the viability goes down too much to reuse?
Well, I think one of the things to mention is we should remove the solids from our yeast cone initially within about 12 hours of pitching, because a lot of the solids that are carried over from the brew house, as well as the cold break that forms during the cooling cycle and within that fermenter, is going to precipitate out fairly quickly. So removing those solids lends itself to the production of fewer off flavors in general. So we want to do that right away within the first 12 hours of the fermentation process post pitching. After that, really, each brewer has their own philosophy with regard to cropping yeast or removal of yeast solids from the cone. And a lot of that depends on flocculation rates for those various yeast strains or the conditions with which you're fermenting under. So there's a lot of variability. But typically, initially at the beginning of the crash cooling stage, you'll want to remove your solids once again. And typically those will be those materials that we'll want to discard. Yeast cells that have flocculated early, solids that have precipitated over the fermentation process. And then post-crash cooling, generally we'll do an early discharge that we'll collect and discard. And then during that crash cooling stage, you may take multiple collections, maybe over a couple of days, that you're going to harvest that yeast or find that yeast to be healthy. You may evaluate that yeast, whether it's with your senses, if you're a small brewery, or diluting it and putting it under the scope, staining it with methylene blue or methylene violet to look at the percentage of viable cells. Somehow evaluating that, even using your senses, smelling that cream yeast crop or harvest can give you an indication of its level of health. You can typically smell autolyzed yeast. They become bouillon or brothy aromas and flavors. So you'll be able to determine that. But really, it's over experience with each yeast strain. Each brand of beer you're producing are under different conditions, different levels and hop rates. So you'll determine that. But typically, early croppings are discarded, mid croppings are harvested and repitched, and late croppings are discarded again, like we mentioned. The time frame of that is typically from the beginning of cold crash till a couple of days post crash. But that'll vary depending on how long it's in that vessel, or whether it's moving to a dedicated maturation tank, you're racking off into a dedicated maturation tank. So once again, you hate to tell somebody this, but it depends. It really depends on each particular case. But that's kind of a good ballpark number to throw in there from the beginning of crash cooling till a couple days post. And those mid collections are those that you typically harvest and repitch. And there are brewers pitching from cone to cone successfully, but typically over generations, they're seeing a decrease in yeast vitality and potentially an increase in flavor changes as the number of generations increase. And it's just because we're dragging over a higher percentage of other solids.
Okay, thank you. I saw one more question come in. I'm going to ask that one. And then any other questions, you can direct to our email address, brewing@lallemand.com. Considering that hydrogen sulfide can be reabsorbed by the yeast, would it be an acceptable strategy to add fresh yeast and potentially sugar at the end of fermentation in order to reduce any H2S that's present?
That's typically not something you'd like to do, because you're going to create greater flavor changes within your finished product. If it's done on a typical basis, it may be feasible. One of the other problems that are encountered with that is dispersing that yeast evenly in suspension, homogeneously, so that it's interacting with the substrate as a whole rather than minimizing its contact, and also dispersing that sugar solution or whatever else may be included. But if you're creating the potential for that yeast to carry out an additional fermentation stage, you have the potential to create other flavors. So unless that's a normal part of your process, I wouldn't recommend it. If we have H2S present going into our late maturation stages and it's not being eliminated, if you have the potential to recirculate the beer at that point in the process and potentially add some healthy yeast, that might be a potential way to eliminate it, like we mentioned, keeping yeast in suspension. But it's not a practical application, let's put it that way. But it might be your only viable alternative to save that batch, or perhaps create that as a saleable product without putting it to the drain. So it's a potential, but it's not really a practical or viable alternative in most cases.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, John Maria, for sharing your expertise with us today. Again, for more details about hydrogen sulfide in beer, you can see our technical paper that's linked on this webinar as well as on our website. This crowdcast will be posted on our website as well as on YouTube as well. So look out for that if you want to come back and visit it again later. Thank you, everybody, for attending this collaborative webinar between Lallemand Brewing and the Siebel Institute of Technology. And thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.